Hello guys and welcome back. Today we continue and finish the Leopard 1 A5DK from the last episode. This part will feature both the painting and weathering. First we have to take the kit apart into smaller sub-assemblies. That makes painting easier and we can ensure that we get the paint into all corners. Then we start with a primer. Usually I go with a black primer, but not this time. Instead, I'm choosing an olive drab primer. There are two main reasons for this. As you could already see in the thumbnail, I will be painting this tank in the white UN livery. A slightly lighter base should therefore make it easier for the white paint to cover properly. Furthermore, I think these leopards were originally olive green before they were repainted white. Therefore, this color can give me a more realistic base tone. I apply the primer in several thin layers to ensure that all the fine details are preserved. Unfortunately, the two holes from the previous episode in the front armor were still too clearly visible, so I had to touch them up and repaint them once more. I primed the road wheels in black anyway. This should make the final result a bit darker and help it stand out better from the rest of the tank. For the tracks, I used my own mixture. Track primer and rust lightened with a little white. I didn't want the metal parts of the tracks to rust too much, as I want to depict the vehicle in use. Since the road wheels are already dry, I can directly spray on the light grey for the outer rubber part. Next I will start with the white. At first glance you might think that the camouflage paint for UN vehicles is very simple, namely just white. This may be true on real vehicles, but on a model it would quickly look too uniform and flat. Therefore, we should work with very subtle color variations here. To achieve this, I've varied my white base coat with a light beige tone. This darkens it slightly and also makes it look a bit dirty. At first glance, it still looks like ordinary white, but the difference will become more apparent later. I now spray the entire vehicle with this. 2 to 3 coats were necessary. I'm portraying a Leopard tank from the Operation Bøllebank, translated as bully bashing in English. This was part of the UN mission in Bosnia in 1994, in which the Danish Jutland Dragoon Regiment participated. It was the Danish Army's first combat deployment since World War II. A total of 10 Danish Leopard tanks and 1 APC were involved in this operation. I can also paint the road wheels with the airbrush. An inexpensive circular stencil works perfect as a mask to paint only the inner part. This is a significantly cheaper alternative to aftermarket wheel masks, although the fit isn't always 100% perfect. This is what our model looks like so far. The slight yellow tint of my base color is also more visible under this light. Now we begin with the color modulation. The color difference is now clearly visible with pure white. I will spray all surfaces again with this, leaving the edges and corners untouched. This will create artificial shading and color variations. For this, I recommend a finer airbrush and more diluted paint. The transitions should ultimately be seamless. Here at the rear you can see my approach even better. I leave all the recesses in details as they are and concentrate mainly on the larger surfaces. These should ultimately be the brightest. Previously, I mixed a drop of cream white into my white for a smoother transition. Now, however, I'm spraying exclusively white. Same principle as before, except I'm now reducing the size of the areas and concentrating even more on the few larger ones. They should end up really bright, just like the original. Now the whole thing looks much brighter like I wanted. And even though the color differences are subtle, they make a big difference in giving the whole thing more depth. For the finest highlights, I use a brush. AK Interactive Intense White is even brighter than my previous colors. I'm painting all the details and protruding areas, the cable channel, hinges, bolts and edges. Basically everything that is slightly raised. This allows us to strongly emphasize all these details, which come from both the main kit and the conversion kit. And that is probably one of the most important and difficult aspects of achieving a uniform, all-white camouflage scheme. Color variations when you have very little leeway. And even though this step might seem a bit unrealistic at first, in my opinion it's crucial for the final result. How far you take this step is entirely up to you. You can, like me, try to highlight every bolt and rivet, or you can focus on the larger details and edges. However, some parts need to be painted black or dark grey. One of them is this long telescope. For this I am using Revell's Aqua colors. The covers of the smoke launcher and the inner part of the new searchlight are also painted black. Now we'll turn our attention back to the tracks for a moment. The Leopard has large rubber pads on the outside, which of course can't rust. Therefore I have to touch them up with a brush. It's not complicated, it just takes a little time. The inner part of the tracks wouldn't rust due to constant contact with the wheels. It would remain shiny. For this I use a metal pigment that I apply with a cotton swab. Since the pigment doesn't adhere very well to the track teeth, I'm adding a focused touch of silver dry brushing here. The lights at the rear are painted in clear red and clear orange respectively. I will use this medium grey tone for the machine gun on the turret. So far I like it the best as a base for metal parts. Olive green and brass are for the ammunition box. The return rollers also have a rubber rim. However, this step can be skipped as they will no longer be visible with the side skirts attached. Generally, not much of the lower hull will be visible later. Nevertheless, I will apply some matte effects here, so that the areas that will still be visible don't stand out too much. I start with this acrylic effect, which I apply like a wash. You can thin and adjust it with water. However, I recommend working in smaller sections as acrylic effects dry quite quickly. Next, I will use this thicker matte effect, which is actually intended for dioramas. This one is also acrylic based. I first apply some of it to the center of the lower hull. These are the areas that will be most visible later. Compared to the previous effect, this one has a lot more texture. Here too, I will soften the transitions a bit with water. but since most of it will only partially be visible later, if at all, as I already mentioned, I didn't spend too much time on here. Once everything is dry, I have already received a result I am happy with. In some cases, only parts of the wheel were left green, which is why I painted some of them two-tone with a brush. These few splashes of color help to add some color variation to the otherwise monochrome tank. I also painted the spare wheels from the resin kit green. I will later attach these to the tank as cargo. Thanks to the polycaps, attaching the wheels is easy. In many pictures it was mainly the rear wheels that were replaced with green ones. I assume the rear wheels experienced more wear due to the higher weight load. After practically welding the tracks together with a lot of superglue, I can carefully pull them onto the running gear. Of course, I hide the ugly connection piece where it's covered by the side skirts. These are now also glued in place with superglue. The kit does not include any UN decals, and I didn't have any in my spare box that were a good fit either. Therefore, I printed all the necessary decals myself on decal paper. After soaking them in some water, I can attach them to the turret using decal fix. The quality isn't comparable to professionally produced decals, of course, but it's sufficient for my purposes. Regarding the decal placement, there seem to have been slight variations between the vehicles. All tanks have the large UN letters on the turret and the front, but the weight markings and the Danish coat of arms appear to be positioned differently from vehicle to vehicle. After applying everything, I will apply 2 protective coats of clear varnish for a few hours apart to compensate for the somewhat weaker adhesion. I almost forgot to paint the small cable on the turret for the spotlight. The headlights have transparent plastic parts, which I can now attach with ultra glue. Chipping is something we usually associate with tanks from the World Wars. But these Leopards were also in action, so we should find some signs of wear here as well. For this I'm using NATO olive, which the tanks were probably primed in under the white. However, one should be careful when adding the chipping and not overdo it. Firstly, dark chips are very noticeable and clearly visible against the white, and secondly, the vehicles, even in combat, remained relatively undamaged, at least compared to Tigers, Panthers and the like from the Second World War. Therefore, I'm focusing on the areas that, due to their function, were subject to greater wear and tear. The side boxes, rear covers, tow hooks and a few selected edges are a good starting point. Less is definitely more here. One area where we can expect to see a bit more wear and tear are the side skirts. These would probably show the most wear. The front and rear mud flaps are made of rubber. That's why I'm using a dark grey paint for the chipping. These are probably the areas that experience the most wear, because paint is most likely to chip off flexible rubber parts. I will also use dark grey for the tools on the back. I sprayed the large side exhausts black with my airbrush. Especially against the white background, this creates a very nice contrast. And the sooty rear is quite iconic for the Leopard 1 after all. To achieve the softer transition, I diluted the paint considerably, and I am working in several layers again. Now I'm protecting the whole thing again with yet another layer of clear varnish. For the wash, I'm using a pre-mixed neutral grey from AK. The wheels are again well suited for testing the color first. The right balance is incredibly important here. On the one hand, we naturally want to highlight these details and recesses, but still maintain the white. That's why I diluted the wash considerably again, just to be safe. In areas with lots of texture, I apply it evenly with an even higher dilution. As you can see here, even very small amounts of paint are already enough to darken the white considerably. The turret's anti-slip surface naturally gives it a rich texture. This is a nice detail which I absolutely want to highlight. Therefore, I decided to apply a large-scale wash on the entire top surface. This allows me to best highlight the texture in my opinion. However, in order to not darken the turret too much, I'm leaving the sides almost completely untouched. To lighten the surface slightly again, I carefully rub a watercolor pencil over the anti-slip texture. This should lighten only the very tips, leaving the dark texture intact. For the remaining matte effects, I'd like to try out a new technique again: liquid and dry pigments. First, I apply the liquid pigments to the edge of the wheel, avoiding the center as much as possible. Then I distribute some regular pigments everywhere. Using little white spirit, I can now move everything into the desired position. This should also ensure better adhesion for the pigments. In my reference images, the mud primarily collected at the outer edge, which created a very nice contrast to the light center. I'm now doing this with all the wheels, varying the intensity as I go. The effect itself worked well. However, I definitely chose the wrong pigment color, and I don't like the color at all, because it doesn't match the previous effects. Therefore, I will have to rework it with a slightly darker matte effect. This will result in the loss of some texture, but the color should blend in better with the rest. I will also use this color for the wash for the tracks. Overall, I will be using fewer matte effects than usual. A few splashes on the side skirts won't hurt though, especially at the back where they are shortened. To avoid any unwanted splashes, I've masked off that area as a precaution. Since this effect is enamel based again, I can blend it with white spirit. Of course, the front and back of the hull wouldn't stay clean either, so I'll spread a few splashes here as well. The white background will naturally ensure that even subtle effects are clearly visible, which we will use to our advantage. In some places I want to make at least the outermost edge a little dirtier, so I apply the mud very carefully with a brush and blend it with white spirit as needed to achieve the desired intensity. During the UN missions, all tanks had the corresponding flag displayed on their turrets. Therefore, I printed the UN flag as a decal. I use a regular piece of paper as my base, onto which I apply the decals on both sides. Adding a little white glue to the water improves the adhesion. Once everything is dry, I can carefully shape the flag into a realistic form using the handle of a brush. I will paint the inner ring of the spare wheels metallic silver. I must mention again that these resin wheels look really great. I still have a few bags and some luggage for the turret. The bags will first be primed in a khaki tone, and I will paint the water canisters olive green. Using lighter colored dry brush, I can now bring out all the wrinkles more clearly. The canisters are getting a few light signs of wear with some silver flaking. Finally, a dark wash to emphasize the shadows. I carefully remove the excess wash with a tissue. I'll make an exception and add a few antennas. To do this, I melted and stretched parts of the sprue. I'm now carefully gluing these to their bases with superglue. Last but not least, I can paint them black. But be careful, they can still break very easily. I speak from experience. And that's it. Let's see the final result. This tank was definitely a challenge, but in a good way. Not only was it my first complete conversion kit, but also my first attempt at a white camouflage scheme. I have to say, I had to adapt many techniques I'm used to. These kinds of models are definitely more prone to errors and mistakes are harder to correct. All in all, I still had a lot of fun and it was a very interesting change from my usual models. I learned quite a bit and maybe you did too. If you know more about white UN camouflage than I do, please let me know. I would definitely like to address this topic again in the future. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please like and subscribe to never miss any future uploads. Any feedback or suggestions, let me know in the comments. Thank you all for watching and see you next time.